While the Nutty Putty Cave disaster is often regarded as one of the most dreadful incidents in caving history, those familiar with the Sterkfontein tragedy might argue that it deserves the top spot due to the sheer misfortune surrounding the event. The Sterkfontein tragedy is marked not only by the grim outcome, but also by the devastating sequence of missed opportunities and bad luck that led to Peter Verhulsel's prolonged suffering and eventual death. Nuno Gomez had been exploring an unmapped section of the Sterkfontein Cave system for the past couple months. This was an incredible cave system in South Africa, where many anthropological discoveries have been made, including a 2.3 million-year-old skeleton. It consisted of mostly dry cave areas, but Nuno was interested in the wet cave system. On this day, September 29, he would be leading a small group in an effort to lay a permanent guideline for the farthest point of the wet cave area, Milne Hall. Peter Verhulsel and Malcolm Keeping would be assisting him in getting this line set by feeding him the line from the surface and being the surface monitors for this dive. Nuno had done this exact dive twice over the past month, so it was no surprise when everything went as planned to lay the permanent line covering the 396-foot distance from the Milner Lake entrance through a tight squeeze to a small air pocket at the end of the main tunnel. After the line was set, he, Peter, and Malcolm would follow it along to the small air pocket at the end, almost as a recreational dive considering its simplicity. The small room was only about 30 square feet, like a short hallway just 3 feet wide and 10 feet long. The men moved easily along the line, passing dozens of small passages in the Swiss cheese infrastructure of the cave tunnel, and finally popped up in the air pocket one after the other. They enjoyed a brief discussion of how they might be the first humans to stand exactly where ancient ancestors may have been millions of years before. It was exciting and a bit inspiring for their explorer soul. They each knew that there might be an artifact or bone along these paths, which must have made them all feel like true explorers in uncharted territory. This was the last conversation that the three men would ever have together. They headed back out to the Milner Lake area, just planning to follow the guideline out the relatively shallow tunnel. It was only 13 feet deep, so there wasn't a lot of room to get away from the guideline, and it was a direct route to the exit. As Nuno led the men out, he felt a tug on his fin from Malcolm. He signaled that Peter was no longer behind him. Nuno moved back to see if Peter had fallen behind. He looked for a few moments, then caught a glimpse of Peter's flashlight down one of the side tunnels. Nuno was frankly annoyed, but it was understandable, the irresistible drive to take a quick look at what lay beyond. He signaled to Peter to follow him back to the guideline, and they continued on their way. As they approached the squeeze to exit the tunnel, Peter had disappeared again. This time, after a short look around, the two men exited the tunnel to re-emerge in the open lake room. They wanted to check if Peter had taken the other exit tunnel by chance, but there was no sign of him. Nuno and Malcolm turned around and re-entered the tunnel along the guide rope. Nuno explored away from the line to side tunnels and areas he was aware of, looking to see signs of Peter's light, but this time there was nothing. Over the next 4 hours, Nuno and Malcolm searched back and forth along the path and main lake to see if they could locate Peter. They had started stirring up the silt with their mini trips, so visibility was reducing hour after hour. Although they were worried, they still were confident that Peter was waiting it out in one of the many air pockets that were likely at the end of all of those side passages. They just needed to figure out which one. After using all of their air tanks, they called for help in the late afternoon. The fire brigade divers came out, but were unable to enter the cave due to lack of cave diving expertise. Nuno had also called a fellow diver, Craig Stevenson, who had been in this very tunnel with him just weeks before. Nuno and Craig used the new air cylinders to try again to locate Peter. Eventually, police divers showed up in the evening and took over the search. Nuno and Malcolm were exhausted and hypothermic. The silted water had reduced visibility to zero. The police called off the search for the night and were now certain that it would simply be a body recovery from here on out. Peter had been excited about the possibilities beyond this main pathway. As the three men started their return trip, he was eager to take a quick peek at what might be just beyond his line of vision. He turned into one of the large side tunnels, just planning to illuminate the way with his flashlight and figure out how far it might go. When Nuno grabbed his fin to bring him back, he knew that was the right thing to do. It was thrilling to see the walls of a cave that might have had ancient occupants or led to a new lake surface deep inside, but no additional line had been set, and they didn't have any rope with them to tie in for safety. The pull was just too great for Peter as he passed passage after mysterious passage, each full of incredible possibilities. He finally turned off again and quickly proceeded down a new tunnel. The formations in these dark, water-filled caves made even simple paths seem like challenging mazes. The orientation in 3 dimensions added a difficulty factor that's hard to explain. Because the flashlight could only illuminate a sliver of the path at a time, there is no familiarity with which paths were taken previously. Nothing looked familiar as Peter tried to return to the guideline. The movement in the narrow tunnels disturbed the wall silt and made visibility low. After testing many possible paths, he saw the silvery surface of water above him. He pushed up and found himself in an incredible small room that no one else had ever seen before. It was a thrilling relief to have the safety of air and the opportunity to look around this new space. He had tried everything he could in the water to locate the guideline, but now he needed to just stay put and wait for his friends to find him. Peter waited. He looked around the room with his flashlight. There were a few narrow passages that seemed to lead off in different directions, which as an expert dry caver, he would be glad to explore later once they had set some additional guidelines. For now, he needed to just wait. He pointed his light into the water to signal to Nuno and Malcolm if they entered this section of the caves. The initial excitement had started to wear off when Nuno emerged from the small lake in front of him. There were no sounds, no air bubbles, and no disturbances in the water surface. He turned off his light to conserve the 30 minutes of battery power that remained while he thought about what to do. The general rule at that time was to sit tight when you have an unlimited oxygen supply. No point in diving in an unknown path with only 30 minutes of air and light, with the risk of not being able to find this room of air again. Peter knew that his fellow divers couldn't be too far away and were probably looking for him that very minute. Peter had tried to make noise by banging his tank on the rocks and flashing his light into the water. His adrenaline had worn off and left him in a state of complete exhaustion. He finally fell asleep and thus lost all measure of time in the short term. When he woke up, he wouldn't know if 10 minutes had passed or 10 hours. He was sitting in complete darkness with only the most limited knowledge of the cave he was in. His light only had 1 hour total of battery, and half of that was used during his initial dive with Nuno and Malcolm. So with no light, no food, and no reference of time, Peter was not sure how long he might have to wait to be discovered. He had plenty of air and drinking water, so the essential requirements for life were abundant. It quickly occurred to him that at this point, they may believe him to be drowned. It was a horrible dilemma. He had enough air in his tank to swim out the short distance to the exit, if he only knew the path. Waiting continued to be the only option, relying on the fact that they would continue searching until he was found. After that first night of searching, the police locked down the caves to bar anyone from diving or caving until they had completed their recovery mission. The tunnels were completely silted out and needed days to clear up. Since they had limited resources and were sure that it was a mission to recover a body, they didn't come back for a week. They then spent a day searching the bottom of the pathway to locate a body and the various tunnels that had yet to be explored. There was absolutely no sign of Peter. The following weekend, they returned again. The police had not allowed any civilians to join their dive mission. Nuno couldn't stand that they had not asked for his help and was determined to get back into those caves and locate Peter for his family. Nuno knew that there were plenty of crevices and formations that could easily hide a body from searchers, and he had done all he could to help find Peter. Little did he know that at that very moment, Peter was inside fighting for his life. As the hours and days passed, Peter must have realized that his rescuers were having trouble finding him. He really had no way of judging whether 1 week had passed or 3. He was hungry and in complete darkness. While his flashlight was working, he had noticed the several passages that might lead to a dry exit. In complete darkness now, he ventured to the edges of his room and eventually followed a path nearly 120 feet away from the water's edge. It ended up being just a dead end of rock, so Peter continued to stay by the water in hopes of a rescue team finally locating his little cave. Now, he was too weak from lack of food and sitting alone in the dark for weeks. This devastating reality is true torture. Studies have shown that people can hallucinate and start losing their sanity after just hours of complete silence and no visual stimulation. Peter had been surviving day after day in an unknown state of mind. His body was deteriorating as his own muscle tissue was being used to fuel his body. Starvation is a traumatic state all on its own, but combine that with the deprivation of light, sound, and social interaction, and you can imagine the nightmare that Peter was suffering. The only somewhat reasonable measure of time would have been the growth of his beard. His facial hair had grown substantially, which might have given him some sort of reference about days or weeks passing by. He was probably sleeping for most of the time because he had no food to fuel activity and no light to initiate wakeful periods. The biology of his life was breaking down little by little. Peter was barely hanging on after starving for weeks and losing 44 pounds of body weight. The hopelessness is truly stunning, with no way to signal anyone that you are in fact still alive and suffering hour by hour. Peter collapsed next to the water, thinking that his savior would come up in diving gear and rescue him from this tomb. But Peter was wrong. Divers wouldn't find him, but dry cavers would. The police continued their weekend diving for 6 weeks, and then finally called off the search with no result. At this point, they opened the dry caves again, but kept the water portions closed to divers. As soon as it was opened, local Speleological Association volunteers started searching for a connection between the dry caves and the wet ones. Roger Ellis led this group, and Nuno joined them. After just a few hours of searching, a connection was found by Nuno himself. He found a breakthrough section that revealed a watery surface connected to the dry caves. This was astonishing news. This was the first confirmation that the extensive dry cave system did in fact connect with the water-filled tunnels. Other volunteers found a set of footprints that led to a dead end of rock. It was a completely unexpected finding and stirred everyone's hopes for locating Peter. Roger Ellis came to a new water connection and was stopped short by what he saw. Laying next to the water was the emaciated body of Peter Verhulsel. He had not drowned after all. In fact, he lived for an astonishing 3 to 4 weeks. His facial hair had developed into a beard, and he had clearly lost more than 40 pounds. His new air tank was nearly full, but it was completely banked up. As they took stock of his situation, they saw a message written next to Peter's body. It simply said, "I love you, Cheryl and Ma." There is no way to know exactly what Peter suffered during that time, but he clearly fought to hang on to the very limits of the human body. Dozens of divers were all searching in this relatively small space, but he just had no way to signal the rescuers. One diver had come up in an opening just 100 feet from Peter's location. If he had yelled loudly enough, might they have been able to hear each other in these connected tunnels? The echoes of that question remained, along with many other what-ifs. If the dry caves had been left open, this search would have located a living Peter in just one day. Peter's autopsy revealed that he had died of starvation after more than 3 weeks alone. This was a devastating realization for Nuno. Despite the grisly outcome of this dive, Nuno went on to set several diving records and write a book about his many diving experiences, including the tragic story of Sterkfontein.